So the other day I put together a video about my trip down the Murrumbidgee. It was a 200-kilometre trip and it took about 5 days. If you haven't seen it, the link's up here. But what I was amazed about was the number of questions I got about my paddling in terms of multi-day trips, things that I take with me, just tips and tricks generally. So I thought, why not put together a video and answer all of your questions? So let's get into it. Roll the intro. So there's basically three main categories of questions that people had. There's firstly questions about gear, and we'll get into that first because that's my favourite topic. Then there's just general advice and general questions about multi-day paddling and solo paddling. And then finally there's some fairly specific questions about the Murrumbidgee itself, so we'll jump into those at the end. So let's look at your questions. So the first question about gear is, what do I paddle? And that's a pretty obvious question, but basically I paddle the Barracuda Enigma, which is that one there in the middle, when I'm doing multi-day trips. The reason for that is firstly it's really lightweight, so even though it's 5.2 meters long, it's made of very lightweight plastic, so it actually weighs 19 kilos. So in terms of just being able to lug it around with all the gear, it makes life a lot easier. But that durable plastic is really good for those trips because, as you'll see in my Murrumbidgee video, there's a lot of dragging it over mud, there's, pulling it up and down banks. It just means by having that lightweight plastic, you don't need to worry about it. The other boat we've got here is the Mirage, that's carbon fiber. I don't like using that when it's low water paddling, and the main reason for that is because when you're dragging down over like pebble runs in the river, you don't have to worry about ripping the bottom of the boat out. If you have a look at the bottom of the boat, I've got a lot of big gouges and scratches in there, and it's just a confidence thing, and every time you do scratch the bottom of the boat, you don't have to worry about thinking you're gonna have to spend the night patching it. The other reason I like it is it's just got a lot of storage space. So the front compartment, the back compartment, and even that sort of day compartment on the middle of the boat is really good. So I can fit plenty of gear, and I tend to paddle a fairly heavy boat when I'm doing rivers, just purely because I like the luxuries in the boat. And then the final point, the reason I like it is the cockpit's really quite large, so you've got a lot of room in there. And it just makes it a little bit more comfortable when you're in a boat for 6, 7, 8 hours, that you can move around a little bit more and you're not sort of feeling confined. So I love the Enigma, I've had it for a few years, and it's definitely my favourite for doing longer trips. So the next question is, what paddle do I use? And the paddle I use is this one here for touring. So this is called, it's the Epic, and it is the, what's it called? The Active Touring Full Carbon. So the reason I like this paddle is that it's got a really nice surface area for doing long distance paddling. But it's also, when you're in a river and you've got to do a fair bit of manoeuvring around logs and things in the river, it's just nice to use from that perspective. I come from a whitewater background, so I'm kind of used to having that sort of more flat blade. The other paddle I do use, but not necessarily for long distance paddling or multi-day paddling, is the Epic Club Carbon. So this is more for like if I'm on the harbour or just doing some training and things like that, because it's more got that curved blade and it's a lot better for just doing things like speed. But I generally carry that as my spare paddle, folded up on the back of the boat. Okay, so the next question is more about the camping side of things, and it is, do I use a one-person or a two-person tent? So what I have is I've got two tents that I use, and depending on the trip I will use one or the other. The first one I've got is the Nemo Hornet, which is a great one-person tent. It's tiny, it's really lightweight. And then I've got the MacPack Duolite. And I tend to use the Duolite more because it's a two-person tent, and there's a couple of reasons for it. So firstly, whilst this is small and compact, the reality is I shove them, either one, right down the back of the boat. So it's pretty much filling up that tiny point at the back. And both of them really fill the same amount of space. So from a size perspective, it doesn't really matter. Weight-wise, again, it's not a huge amount difference, so I tend to go for the bigger tent. The other reason for it is that there's a couple of things. So firstly, I spend a lot of time in the tent because if you think about it, you paddle all day, you get out, especially in winter, the sun goes down at 5:30. You might sit around for the fire bit, but then you spend a lot of time in the tent reading a book or hanging out in your sleeping bag. So it's just nice having a bit more space to be able to sit up and just spend time in the tent. Also, I do like to sit in the tent and sort out my gear. So you have a lot of different dry bags, a lot of things that you're sorting out. It's just nice having that extra space in the tent as well. The other good thing about having a two-person tent when you're on your own is you also, in this case, have the two exits and entrances. And having those two vestibules, it's really nice to be able to put all your wet kayaking gear and stash that in one of the entrances, and then use the other one to get in and out and to cook and things like that. So I've been tending to use this a lot more with the kayaking, and then I'll tend to use this if I'm doing a lightweight hiking trip, or if I'm going over, just doing an overnight trip in the kayak, I might just take that one. Okay, the next question is, do I use an EPIRB? So an EPIRB, for those who don't know, it's like an emergency beacon or a personal emergency beacon. I don't use an EPIRB as such. The reason for that is I actually use my Garmin GPS to provide the same service. So what I've got is the Garmin InReach Explorer Plus. This is a fantastic little unit. They're not cheap, but the reason it's great is, firstly, it obviously provides all the GPS and mapping stuff you'd expect. To be honest, I don't really use that much. I have this running at all time, but I tend to still use a paper map sitting on my deck. However, the services that this provides kind of replace the need for an EPIRB, because what you can do is subscribe to the InReach service that they have, and it's not necessarily cheap, but it's got some great features to it. Plus, you can actually suspend your subscription, so if you're not going to paddle for a few months, you can turn it off and then reactivate it when you need it. So the services that it provides is, firstly, it's got an SOS option, so you can actually flick that open, hit the button, and the InReach service will contact all the emergency services that are required, as well as they will contact your next of kin, because you can register them. The other thing that it also does is, I use this to, when I'm solo paddling, I'll activate the tracking feature. So what you can do is you can actually have this sending your track to the InReach service. I set it up to send it every 10 minutes. You can see the map, and your family and friends can actually see where you are at all times. So it's just a nice sort of peace of mind. It also gives your family a bit of a ability to see where you're up to and what you're doing. The other thing it also provides, which is really helpful, is it also has a messaging service. Again, it's not cheap. I think it's like 75 cents a text message, and it's pretty fiddly to type your messages, but just means that if you are trying to communicate with your family or your friends and just let them know you've got to the campsite or something's going on or you're changing your plans and you don't have any mobile services, you can actually send them emails and text messages through the GPS via satellite. So it's just helpful for those circumstances where you don't have mobile service. So it's a great little unit. Okay, so the next question is, what cameras do you use? So obviously I like filming things, so I take more cameras probably than most people would take on their trip. But I've kind of played around with different options on my trips. Before, I've taken things like my DSLR camera, which is big and bulky, and I tend not to use that. So I've pretty much got it down to a couple of things. So firstly, I use my GoPro. So this is the GoPro Hero Black 8 on a float. So it can be dropped underwater or you can stick it underwater. This I use for just more a lot of the what we call B-roll shots. So it's just the general shots of the river and ducks and things like that. I then also use obviously a drone. I won't talk too much about drones today, but I've got the Mavic 2 Pro. It's got a fantastic camera on it, but it's just compact. So I can have this sitting in my deck bag. When I want to fly it, I just sort of pull it out. I can pull out the propellers and pretty much launch it from my boat and then catch it as well. So it's pretty practical and it's a great camera on that. The other thing that I then tend to use a lot is my iPhone. So a lot of the filming I do now is on the iPhone 11. The cameras are great. It's there, it's easy. I sit it right on the front of my deck bag and I can just grab it when I want to use it. So a lot of the stuff I do when I'm talking to the camera is just using my iPhone. And then I carry a Gorilla Pod with me, so if I want to do any shots on the beach or watching, the boat launching and stuff, I can either stick my GoPro or just put the iPhone into the Gorilla Pod. So it's very handy, that one as well. Okay, so the last question in the gear section is, what are some essential or luxury items you like to take on multi-day trips? So that's pretty general, but there are a few things I thought I'd talk about. So firstly, I'll tell you what, I'll start with this, the mug. Now the reason I bring that up is you'll see in my video I made a bit of a deal about the fact that I'd split my mug and I had to gaffer tape it together. And the reason for that was, for years I've been using these insulated mugs when I'm paddling. And one thing I noticed recently was, the one thing I wanted after a long cold paddle was warm hands. And when you're using an insulated mug, it doesn't actually provide you with any warmth on your hands because it's insulated. So that was why I actually went and tried using one of those melamine cups, which did split itself in the first day. So what I'm actually going to start doing is just using a good old tin mug, just so I've got something that's durable, but also that you can actually warm your hands at the end of the day. So can't compromise on your mug, and make sure you get a good one. Now the next thing that is something that I find is essential, and I cannot recommend it more, is a Gore-Tex paddle jacket. Now the reason for that is I've used this a lot paddling in pouring rain in Sydney Harbour. I've used it in wind, I've used it on just really cold days, and having a Gore-Tex just makes such a difference, because while you're paddling you want to feel loose while you're paddling, you don't want to feel restricted. You want something that can breathe, and then obviously you want something that keeps you dry. Also having the Velcro rubber wrists helps a lot too, because it just stops the water coming in. So definitely this is one of my favorite things that I own. Again, it's Gore-Tex, they're not cheap, but it's definitely an investment if you're going to do any paddling or a lot of paddling, especially in winter. Can't go past a Gore-Tex jacket. The other thing that I love is my deck bag. So this one is a Chinook technical outdoor deck bag. It's one that I bought online, but this is great because you can just have it literally sitting on the top of your deck. You can store everything that you need to grab really quickly. So whether it's water bottles, I actually carry my cameras and my drone inside it, so they're just there available on the deck. It's not overly waterproof, so everything still needs to be in dry bags, but it's just nice when you're spending all day in the boat just to have a little bit more access to some of the things. The other thing that's great is if you are stopping and walking into town to the shops or something like that, it does sort of double up as a carry bag, so I put all my valuable stuff in it. I can use it as a bit of a, like a backpack when I go into town. So it's definitely worth investing in. My boat, as I showed you before, still does have that compartment in the top, but I find that just if I want to grab a camera or grab something, it just gives you a little bit more space. Obviously, if you're ocean paddling, this is not such a good idea. You want everything concealed inside the boat, but on rivers, long trips, lakes, things like that, this is great. And then the final thing that it is a luxury item, but at the end of the day, when you've been paddling, sitting in your boat, the last thing you want to do is just sit on the ground or on a log. So this is kind of my luxury item, which is a fold-up chair. And this is a great fold-up chair, the Helinox, because it's comfortable and it's really easy to put together. So it folds up really nicely, a bit like your tent poles. The legs all fold up like that. And if we do a little bit of magic, so as you can see, it's kind of small, but it's very comfortable. A couple of things to note with it is the legs. If you're sitting on a beach, the legs will sink into the sand. So what I tend to do is either use it on solid ground, or I might put a couple of dry bags under the feet just to stop it going into the sand. But it's super comfortable and it is definitely my luxury item. But as I said before, it's much appreciated at the end of a long paddle. Alright, so now we're just getting into some general tips and general questions that people have had. And the first question is, what do I find hardest about long distance paddling? So for me, it's not necessarily the paddling itself that's the hardest piece, unless I haven't paddled for a while, I'm not feeling very fit. It's actually the dealing with stuff outside of the paddling. So firstly, you'll see in this video, if it's a low water situation, it's dealing with mud, climbing out of the bank, the sort of uncertainty of where you can actually get out of the water, those sorts of things. The other thing is just making sure you're managing your gear properly. So what I mean by that is you do spend a lot of time packing your boat, moving gear, repacking your boat, those sorts of things. So just making sure that you've kind of practiced that. I've been on trips before where people have been with me where they've got a lot of little bits and pieces not organised in the boat, and every time you stop for either camping or for lunch, there's a lot of messing around just trying to get the gear sorted out. So spend some time in the garage or in your backyard practicing the packing of your boat, making sure you're putting things where it's convenient. I still refine it, even on this trip, first day, when I was getting my lunch out, I was finding I was pulling stuff out from the back of the boat, the front of the boat, so I refined how I was packing it on the second day, just to make it a little bit more convenient. I do actually do myself a diagram of where everything is packed and what dry bags they're in. And that just helps each day helps you remember where things go, because when you've got 10 or 15 dry bags, you want to make sure you remember where they go. So having different coloured dry bags, I write on my dry bags what's in them, and then you can just easily remember where to put them. So not necessarily the hardest thing, but it's just having good management of your gear really does help. What sort of distances do you aim to paddle each day? Obviously this varies depending on whether you're on a lake or you're on a river that's moving or if you're in the ocean. My rule of thumb is that I try and paddle probably 5 hours a day. In the video again you'll see that I did some short days and I did a really long day. I can tell you doing that 70k day took me 9.5 hours with a short break for lunch. That was pretty much my limit. It was the limit of daylight, but it was also, you know, it wasn't something that I necessarily enjoyed. The last few hours got monotonous. So I think 5 hours is kind of just a nice cruisy time to be paddling, and the distances do vary. So in this case, the Murrumbidgee, I think it was flowing at about sort of 3 or 4 k's an hour. By the time I was paddling, I had a heavy boat. I was doing about 8 k's an hour at a comfortable speed. So I was kind of aiming to do maybe 30 to 40 k's in a day, and that just felt like a good distance. If it was a lake, I'd obviously make it less because you're doing a lot more paddling and a lot less drifting. And same with the ocean, it really depends on the currents and the size of the chop that you're dealing with. A couple of other things, when you're planning a trip, for example, like the Murrumbidgee, I tend to try and avoid doing things on weekends. Some of those campsites are fairly popular. You'll see at that one in the video at Colligan's Beach. I got there on the Sunday afternoon. It was obvious that there was a lot of people there on the weekend, being it was school holidays. So I try and avoid staying the nights where I know there's going to be a lot of crowds. That particular campsite had obviously been fairly feral the night before. There was a lot of Jim Beam cans and Bundy cans lying around. So getting there on those popular campsites on midweek or just non-public holidays is a good idea, unless you enjoy getting into that stuff. The other thing is also the water levels. Now, there are plenty of resources to find where the water levels are and what sort of flow that you've got. I'll include some links for some of the New South Wales ones in the site below, but I tend to look at how much water is being released from some of the dams, what the different water levels are across the trip, and in some cases there are also recommendations of whether you should paddle it or not. So some of the areas in the upper Murrumbidgee, for example, it will actually tell you to stay at home or not. I have, in my previous couple of trips, ignored those and probably should have stayed at home because the water was so low. I ended up doing a lot of walking, but I tend to find that's part of the adventure anyway, and I was desperate to go paddling. So yeah, check your water levels as well. The other one, which might sound a bit odd and it's not so sexy, is look after your feet. Again, in my video, you'll see that, you know, when you're getting into your boat, because the boat's so heavy, you actually have to move it quite deep into the water. Otherwise, you're just stuck on the ground and you tend to get wet feet. So I do wear wetsuit booties, but you're pretty much sitting there all day with wet feet. So one thing I do make sure I do when I get to camp is I sit down on the chair I showed you before and I dry my feet thoroughly. I clean them before I put on my socks. Because over a long period of time, if you've got constantly wet feet, you're going to get some pretty gross things happening down there. So the next question is about food and what sort of food do I like to take? What I like to take is food that I actually like. Now, what I've learned over the years is don't take camping food just because it's camping food. So for example, years ago I thought that I should take tins of tuna with me because it's protein, it's tinned, it keeps. I hate tuna, I always have. I never ate it. So I kind of stopped doing that. So what I like to do is essentially make sure I take food that is food that I would eat normally, and stuff that is going to tend to keep. So for breakfast, I'll eat muesli. I use UHT milk. I hate powdered milk, so I wouldn't even bother taking that. Lunches, it's things like wraps, it's salami, it's cheese, it's cucumber, it's things that, again, do keep for a while. And then dinners, I do actually use dehydrated meals because there's a couple of brands out there now. Again, I'm not sponsored, but Backcountry Cuisine, the Outdoor Gourmet Company, they make really delicious meals and they're really easy to make. You can just add water to them, you can rip the top of the bag off and use it as a bowl. And they have really nice varieties of food that you can have. So I had things like lamb roast with vegetables and mash. This is a wild mushroom and lamb risotto, or a chicken tikka masala. They're really nice meals. Again, they're not cheap. They're about 14, 15 bucks each. But you get them from all the outdoor stores, or I just order a whole lot of them online when they're on sale because they'll keep for a couple of years. So yeah, don't compromise on your food. I obviously then take a crap load of lollies and chocolate and snacks and things like that. Okay, so the next set of questions is more about the Murrumbidgee itself. So if you're not interested in the Murrumbidgee, you can stop watching now. But there are a number of things that people were kind of asking about, which parts of the Murrumbidgee they should paddle, where to get in, where to get out. So I'll give you my thoughts about the river itself. As I mentioned in my previous video, I love the Murrumbidgee. I just love that part of New South Wales. I've spent a lot of time in my childhood and in my adulthood in those sorts of areas. But the way I look at the Murrumbidgee, it's kind of broken into two key sections. So you've got Burrinjuck Dam, which is located sort of between Yass and Gundagai on the Hume Highway. And anything sort of upstream from the Burrinjuck Dam, that's more of your white water. So you wouldn't really want to be taking your sea kayak in that sort of area. Then the part which I've sort of been focusing on more recently in my videos is the part below Burrinjuck. And I've personally broken those up into three sections. So the first section, which is in one of my earlier videos, and there's the link to that video, is where you're kind of between Burrinjuck and Gundagai. And honestly, I think that's the most interesting and the best part of the river because the water's really kind of varying, the river's a bit narrower, there's more wildlife, and it's just kind of more of an interesting paddle. So what you want to be just wary of there is, again, the water levels. You don't want it too low. In my video, you'll see I spent a lot of time walking. That's because it was at its base minimum. But generally, sort of later in the year, around November, is when they start releasing the water out of the Burrinjuck Dam, and that's where you'll get a good flow. So there are plenty of good camping spots along the way. There's actually a really good guide, and again, the link is in the description below, which has all of the information about the different days of that paddle, all the way down to Wagga. So definitely worth having a look at that guide. And the distances they have in those, they're kind of short. As I said earlier in the video, I like to paddle maybe 30, 40 kilometers. Most of them are sort of the 20 to 30. So I have sort of strung a few days together. The bit between Gundagai and Wagga, I've got a blog post from many years ago when I did that. It's pretty good. Again, I did it on weekends, so there was kind of a lot of people on boats and things in the area. But yeah, it's probably the second best part of the trip. And then the final section is sort of where I started just in the last week, which was from Wagga Wagga down to Narrandera and beyond that. It is great. It's a really nice part of the area. The issue I had was I did it in very low water, and it wasn't so much because I was dragging the boat across the riverbed. It was more the fact that I was just paddling below very low banks. So you'll see in my video, it was hard work, as I said earlier, finding good campgrounds that I could actually get out of the water because the cliffs were too high. But also psychologically, when you spend 5 days paddling surrounded by these cliffs, you're basically in a chasm. And it became fairly monotonous over a couple of those days, because when you're doing a long paddle and all you can see is cliffs on either side, you essentially feel like you're paddling underground. So I did find that some of those long days, it became very repetitive. So in hindsight, I wouldn't do it again in such low water. If it was just a couple of, like even just a metre higher, I would have been able to see a lot more beyond those cliffs, and it would have made the trip more enjoyable. So there you go. Hopefully I've answered all your questions. Remember, these are just my opinions. I'm not sponsored by anyone. They're just things that I've learned over the years. If you do have any more questions, please add them to the comments below, and do remember to hit the subscribe button in YouTube. That means you'll be notified anytime I put out any more videos. So until next time, catch you later.